Well, students, the computer kind of shut off on me, so I didn't get to finish what I wanted to say to you and get as far in the lecture. I hope you can see me. I can't really tell whether I'm focused in there or not. But where I think I left off was what seems to be consistent in people who are suicide completers, and I think I just had finished discussing that. The next thing I want to talk about is the two common aspects of completers, or the kind of two largest factors, and those are perturbation and lethality, and this still is a part of that whole Schneiderman's grouping. The perturbation, or if you think about the word perturbed, that might help you think about what that word is supposed to mean. It would be referred to as the degree of how upset a person is. How very upset is the person. So I guess if I think for myself, when I'm upset about something, I have a range, a continuum of my level of upsetness. And so a person who's a suicide completer really is at the far end of that scale of upsetness or perturbation. And then the second factor associated with this is lethality. And so the degree of how lethal the person actually feels or becomes. So when these two things appear together, they do seem to be evident in people who are suicide completers. The next thing I want to talk with you briefly about is the myths associated with suicide. Why do we think it's important to talk about this or study this? I would really encourage you to read every single one of the myths that are described in the textbook. You might even want to read more, do more research about myths associated with suicide. Why is that important? Because as you're doing an assessment and talking with a client, you really want to know the difference between whether something is true or not true as it relates to suicidality. And, excuse me, so in your textbook there are about 20 different myths that are described and explained, and I will just talk about a few of those right now, but I would think that this would be an important enough thing for you to learn about that you would want to read all of those. So one of those is, if you bring up the idea of suicide by asking the client, if the client is thinking about it, you can cause that. You can cause the person to commit suicide. This is not true. In fact, if we think a person sounds like they could be at risk for suicide because we know what the risk factors are and we know what causal factors exist because we studied that, if you start to put these together in your mind and you think, wow, this person has a constellation of risk factors and the situation is such that I would wonder, if we were to ask the person, are you thinking about killing yourself, that might be the thing that saves their life. They may be thinking that no one would ever really bring it up. In fact, often people don't bring it up. They don't ask. And this would be their chance to actually talk it through. And remember, earlier in the other lecture clip, I talked to you about, lost my train of thought. I talked to you about, well, I'm sorry, I can't think of it now. I'm going to have to move on. Anyway, just know that that's a myth. That if you ask a person directly about suicide, you will not cause them. You will not be sued for that. You will not be held responsible. That's important to know. Here's another one. The danger goes away if a person has been behaving suicidally or talking about suicide, and then they kind of seem to stop and they get quite cheerful, actually, or maybe even in the book they use the word euphoric. This can be a sign that they're still at great risk, in fact maybe even greater risk. Why is that? Because the person may have decided really firmly once and for all that they're going to do it, and they just feel so glad that they're going to escape the way they feel. That's sad. That's really sad. So this is a high-risk time, in fact, and so we should be watchful. If we're helping someone or we're helping a family member help someone, then if they report that it looks like things have passed, they're just so cheerful these days, it's like they never would have thought about that. I have a little figure here. Most completed suicides actually happen within 3 months following the beginning of what looks like improved attitude or improved feelings. Let me say that again. Most completed suicides happen within 3 months of it looking like the person is past the risk, or past the danger point, sometimes people would say. So I'm not going to go over any more of those risks, but there are really, myths, but there are some very important ones that you should pay attention to. Read them all. Part 5, assessing someone for the risk of suicide. What do you look for? Well, first thing it's important for us to remember is that any client that we're working with who is experiencing an acute crisis, and by that I mean a big, strong, emotionally charged crisis, we should always ask about suicide. We should never let the client leave without asking about suicide. So in terms of assessment, that's your charge. Don't let a person leave your office or leave your care or leave sitting next to you somewhere if you are, helping them through an acute crisis. Almost all suicide or homicidal clients emit some kind of clue, and they're in page 218 of your textbook. There's a description of how clues can, sort of a description of categories of clues, I guess is what I want to say. And so sometimes these clues can be behavioral. The client behaves in a certain way or does certain kinds of behaviors. I would ask you to look that up in the textbook. Again, I would direct you to page 218 of this edition. Sometimes they are giving verbal clues. These would be things that you probably would think of where a person might make a joke. They're in a bad situation. Maybe they have had an emotional meltdown, what we might call an emotional meltdown. And then we say, I'm so worried about you. I don't want anything to happen to you. I want you to be okay. And the person says, oh, don't worry about it. I'm just going to kill myself. This won't be a problem later. Isn't that good news? And they might make a joke about it, but actually, often when psychological autopsies are done after a person has committed suicide, the verbal cues, the behavioral cues, even the situations that pile up on a person can be noticed, made note of, and people with chagrin look back and say, geez, why didn't we should have known. We should have known. They were showing signs. And so there are particular kinds of things that suicidal people seem to have in common, people who end up being completers. There are things that are either a part of their experience or their behavior or even sort of coping mechanisms and so on that could, when we look at them, we know that they are clues to the risk, and we should know what those are. Going back to the idea of assessment, I've been talking just really kind of about using your own good common sense with assessment, but there are some assessment instruments. There are actually a lot of assessment instruments to discern how much of a risk for suicide a client might be in, and those are often, in the old days, paper and pencil kinds of surveys or questionnaires. They can also be things that now would be done on a computer software program, and so it's helpful for you to know that there are some instruments out there, not just that somebody made up and they thought they were a good idea, but they're actually instruments that have been statistically validated as being useful in discriminating between a person who is going to be suicidal and a person who actually isn't suicidal. And so that can be that can be kind of helpful and sort of a comfort to us as helpers to use something that is black and white. But guess what? Even the best of these written instruments is not better than using an instrument and talking to the person face to face. And actually I believe it could be done using Skype, but seeing the person's demeanor, would be helpful. Noting their vocal tone, noting other kinds of clues like the pace of their speech, their ability to think clearly, high emotion. And so in terms of assessment, it's great to use a pencil and paper or computer-generated instrument, but nothing beats the instrument combined with a clinical interview. It's important to know. There are some clues or risk factors that are more lethal producing or predicting than others, and I have a notation that these appear in your textbook on page 219. So I'm remembering that there's just a big laundry list of clues or risk factors mainly, that if a person is experiencing or exhibiting at least 4 to 5 of these, we should consider that they are at great risk for feeling suicidal, and certainly we should ask them, I would say something like, you've told me 5 or 6 things that are on this list of risk factors for someone who could be suicidal, and so I'm just going to ask you, do you feel like killing yourself? Is that something that you're thinking about? That's exactly how I would say it. So look at that list of the risk factors. It mostly makes sense when you look at the list of contributing factors there. On your lecture outline, I also have a category called cries for help. I sort of talked about this earlier, I believe, making sort of cavalier statements that sound kind of jokey and dismissive, but really have the content of suggesting suicide. And, I suppose in our culture, we joke around like that sometimes, but if I heard a friend say something like that, I would stop, and even if they got mad at me, I would say, are you thinking about killing yourself? You just don't really know. So making cavalier statements is one of those, sometimes people would call a cry for help. Another thing is when a client or a person starts to give away things that are really important to them, sort of prized possessions, the most, important possessions that we own that have meaning to us. If a person starts to distribute those, teenagers or really anybody, an older adult, they're just as much at risk or more than young people. Another kind of cry for help is self-harming or high-risk behavior when a person normally didn't participate in high-risk behavior. So look at that list also, and this I have noted as on page 217, appearing on page 217. The last thing I want to talk with you about is the idea that you could use the triage assessment form to assess a person for how much upset they're feeling. And we've used the triage assessment form off and on in our class, and certainly when we come back together live, Monday and Wednesday, one of those days, we'll use the triage assessment form in addition to the kinds of questions that are more probing questions that are described in your textbook. And I do have a page reference for you on that. It's 220 to 221. And so here's the thing. We do have the triage assessment form. It does help us assess a client on 3 dimensions: their emotional dimension, their behavioral dimension, and how they're thinking, and whether or not they're incapacitated in any of those 3 areas. So the idea about using the triage assessment form, though, is that we might have a client who's in a crisis, and we use the triage assessment form with them, and their scores are kind of moderate, but there could be sort of just a feeling that we have that the person, there's something else, there might be something more to the picture with this client. And if that's the case, and we do sort of get that intuition about it, there are some more probing questions that are presented on this pages 220 and 221 that really can make that triage assessment form go from moderate to very elevated. So the triage assessment form can be used, and you would want to add in some of these more probing, lethality-oriented kinds of questions. Okay, that's all I have for you now. When we get back together in class and we're live, that's my favorite way of teaching you, and I hope that we'll have a chance, because we've done a lot of lecture here, I hope we'll have a chance to do some experiential things in the classroom associated with suicide and assessment and prevention. Thanks.